the units of time are marked off. On the right side of the display, numbers will appear to indicate the display number of the lines or bars. In this case, the line showing total imports is marked with a 1, since it is the first line on this screen. Now let's continue by looking at exports. Exports also rose between 1978 and 1982, but amounted to only 217 million rials at their peak in 1981. They fell to half that level, 113 million rials, in 1982. But Yemen does not depend on the export of materials as a major source of foreign exchange. By far the greatest export of Yemen is labor. As a result, the money that workers in other countries send back is the greatest source of foreign exchange. This money from Yemeni workers in other countries rose from 2.4 billion rials in 1975 to a peak of 6.4 billion in 1977. As late as 1979, they were still greater than or nearly equal to the level of imports. The relationship I want to draw your attention to, however, is in the years after 1980. Imports continued to rise for 2 years after money from workers in other countries peaked. It appears that although both imports and money from workers in other countries have stabilized somewhat, they have done so at levels that put imports about 1.5 billion rials higher than money from workers in other countries. High levels of imports are not unusual for a country with economic growth as fast as Yemen's. Typically, these imports include materials and equipment for modernization and must be considered a wise investment in the future. But sometimes, significant amounts of the import bill are taken up by food. This may restrict the pace of modernization because it absorbs large amounts of money that could be invested in development. Is this the case with Yemen? As you can see from the orange bars, food imports are a substantial portion of overall imports. In fact, they appear to be about the same size as the foreign exchange gap. To show a little more clearly the relationship between overall imports and food imports, let's look at this next display. Here, the level of overall imports is assigned the value 1 and is displayed as the green line across the middle of the screen. Other values will be shown as a percentage or proportion of the overall import level. Food imports are shown by the purple line in the lower portion of the screen. On this scale, you can clearly see that in recent years, food imports seem to be constant at about 30% of overall imports. On the same scale, you can see that money from workers in other countries has dropped from as much as 1.5 times imports to a value in recent years of only 70 or 80% of the import level. Now let's look briefly at what foods make up these food imports in 1978 and again in 1982. Here you see food items divided into 7 groups. From left to right, we have grains, red meat, poultry meat, eggs, dairy products, vegetables, and fruit. The numbers across the middle of the display are the level of 1978 imports in millions of rials. Now, on the same display, let's put the import levels for 1982. You can see that for all groups except eggs, the level of imports increased quite a bit. Overall, agricultural production within Yemen during the same period didn't decline, however. In fact, the total value of agricultural products over the period increased from 3 billion rials to 3.8 billion, over 25%. Well, if agricultural production has been increasing and food imports also increasing, it must mean that increases in production have simply not been able to keep up with increases in demand. If this is the case, then there must be something holding production back or slowing its growth. What could it be? There are, of course, a large number of items that could limit the growth of agricultural production. 4 items present themselves at first glance: land, water, money, and labor. In fact, these factors are not independent, and it is hard to separate the impact of one from the others. With that said, however, we must recognize that there is evidence that labor is probably the major limitation. One indication of this is that when you deduct for changes in prices, you find that the increase in domestic agricultural production has been at almost exactly the same rate as the rate of increase in the labor force, about 2 to 3% per year. In addition, the large number of rural workers that have left the rural areas for higher paying jobs seems to indicate strongly that Yemeni agriculture is being limited by the availability of productive labor. Let me also point out that recent drought conditions that have affected agricultural production occurred after the period we are examining and represent an additional temporary limit. This means that when weather conditions change, this limit will probably be removed, but the barrier presented by labor shortage will probably continue. With this assumption in mind, let's look at projections of food supply and demand to the year 2000. Historically, food demand has been about 35% of the total gross national product. If we project growth in gross national product at an annual 4.5% over the period, and food demand to continue at 35% of GNP, we arrive at total food demand rising from about 2.8 billion rials in 1975 to 8.6 billion in the year 2000. Please note that this projection is in constant 1975 rials. Projecting labor supply over the same period, we see that the number of available rural males between the ages of 15 and 59 will rise from 1 million in 1975 to around 2.5 million in the year 2000. However, as we said, about 50% of the 15 to 34-year-old males leave the rural area to work in the cities or other countries. Some have pointed out that many of these men may return to Yemen because of the discovery of oil here. Although this may be true, these men will still be returning to construction jobs and positions in the city created by the oil industry. Their labor would still remain out of the agriculture sector. In addition, only 69% of the males that remain in the rural area work in agriculture. This remaining workforce, shown in the green shaded area, only grows from around 570,000 in 1975 to 1.2 million in the year 2000. This increase of around 2 to 3% per year must be compared to the food demand curve, which was increasing at 4.5% per year. Instead of making you perform this comparison in your head, however, I can make it easier by placing both curves on the same scale. This scale takes all projected values as measured in constant 1975 rials. It therefore represents both food demand and supply in constant 1975 units. It also shows food imports, which is the orange shaded area between the demand and supply lines. In 1975, Yemeni agricultural production satisfied about 3 billion, or around 70% of the total food demand of 3.8 billion rials. Food imports in 1975 were about 800 million rials. In this display, you can see that by the year 2000, food demand can be expected to rise to 8.6 billion rials, while food supply can only be expected to rise to 4.2 billion. This means that food imports would rise from 800 million rials to 4.4 billion. That's more than 5 times the level of 1975 food imports. This also represents a drop in food self-sufficiency from more than 70% in 1975 to less than 50% in the year 2000. But male labor is not the only labor force in Yemeni agriculture. What happens if we include the female labor force in the food supply projection? It may surprise you, but there is nearly no impact on this initial projection. This is because this display is only affected by differences in growth rates. The female labor force is growing at about the same 2 to 3% per year level as the male labor force, and so the projection based on this growth rate is about the same. Remember, however, that by increasing women in the projection, we have nearly tripled the actual size of the available labor force. This will become important in later projections. One of the obvious weaknesses of this projection is that it assumes that the productivity of labor hours is constant over the projection period. As a general rule, this is not the case. With education and extension programs, labor hours tend to become more productive over time. In this next projection, the orange line, number 4, I have included a typical productivity increase due to the present extension and education programs. Here, we assume that the productivity of labor hours increases by 2.5% per year, starting now in 1985. You can see that although this does raise food production in the year 2000 by over 1 billion rials to a value of 5.3 billion rials, the required food imports are still over 4 times their 1975 value. What other changes might we try to increase Yemeni food production? To answer this question, let's look at a typical agricultural family. This family has 8 people, 2 older adults, 2 junior adults, 2 teenagers, and 2 younger children, 1 male and 1 female. To answer this question, let's look at a typical agricultural family. This family has 8 people, 2 older adults, 2 junior adults, 2 teenagers, and 2 younger children, 1 male and 1 female in each pair. As is typical, however, one of the males, in this case the younger adult, has gone off to work in the city or another country. Now let's look at the way the remaining people spend their work time. What I'm going to do here is bring in a clock by each person. On that clock, we're going to see the way that each person divides his or her work time. For the older male, the bulk of the day is spent in agricultural activities. Only about 10% of his time is taken up by marketing or other non-agricultural work. For the teenage male, about half of his time is spent in agricultural activities. The remaining half is taken up mostly by school. For the youngest male, only perhaps 10% of his time is in agriculture. The bulk of his time is taken up either in school or simply in playing and growing up. On the other side of the family, we begin with the older female. She spends perhaps 25% of her time in agriculture, usually not in the field, but around the home in poultry and cattle raising. The bulk of her time is taken up either in fuelwood collection, the orange area, or in tasks in the home, such as food preparation, the purple area. The younger adult female spends essentially all of her productive time in agriculture, mostly in field activities. The teenage female is able to spend about 25% of her time in agriculture because the bulk of her time is taken up in water collection, the blue area. She also has some tasks around the home. The youngest girl spends her time in a manner very similar to her little brother, some small portion in agriculture, but the bulk either in school or playing and growing up. Now, looking at these times, the question is there waste and low productivity time that could be changed to agriculture? Well, on the male side, the activities seem to be mostly agriculture, school, or other activities that are either of fairly high productivity or are investments in increasing future productivity. On the female side, however, it appears that there may be some chance for improvement. 3 types of low productivity time are shown on the female side: fuelwood collection, water collection, and activities around the home. How might these be reduced? As it turns out, 2 technological changes can have a significant impact on these 3 areas. First, it has been estimated that having water supply in the village might reduce water collection time from around 5 hours to around 1 hour per day per household. Second, it is clear that use of commercial fuels such as butagaz or kerosene would eliminate fuelwood collection time entirely. Commercial fuels also reduce the time required for some tasks around the home. Some estimates are that food preparation time can be reduced from 4 hours per day to only 1. Let's look at the possible impact that these 2 technological changes might have on the ability of these women to work in agriculture. The older female might have as much as 90% of her time available for agricultural activities, such as poultry raising and dairy activities, because her requirement for fuelwood collection has disappeared completely, and only 10% of her time is now required for food preparation. The younger adult female is still able to spend full time in agriculture. The teenage female is able to both increase her time in agriculture and have time to remain in school, like her older brother, because the time for water collection is now only 10% of her day. Her newfound time to stay in school will become important in our later discussions of other areas of the economy. The youngest girl is unaffected. If you look at the labor time overall, you will find that the time for the older female workers in agriculture has increased from 1½ days to 2¼ days, an increase of 50%. Now let's go back to the food supply and demand projection and see what the effect of this change in labor time might be. To begin, we'll rebuild the display as we left it. First, there is the food demand projection. Now, food supply based on male labor with food imports shaded in orange. Now, food supply based on all labor. And now, the food supply based on increased labor productivity. If we add in the increased participation of women so that their hours have increased by 50% in the year 2000, you can see that we have increased the food supply in that year by another 1 billion reals. That's an important improvement, but we're not there yet. Is there anything else that can be done? Well, remember that when I put up the increased productivity line, the orange line, number 4, I said that it reflected the productivity increases that might be expected to occur from the present education and extension programs. The present programs are directed primarily at males. What would happen if we were able to increase the productivity of female labor hours by the same 2.5% per year by extending similar programs to them. As you can see in the green line, line 6, the combined impact of the increased labor time available and the increased productivity of that time is quite large. Our supply projection has now increased to 8.3 billion rials. That leaves a food import gap of only 300 million rials, less than half the size of the actual 1975 food imports. Let's look at one final display before we move out of agriculture. One question that comes to mind when looking at this food supply projection is female labor likely to result in the production of foods that Yemen really needs? On this display, you can see food self-sufficiencies for 1982. Simply stated, this is the amount of total food demand that is satisfied by domestic production for each of the 7 food categories described earlier. You can see that the 4 worst categories are red meat, poultry meat, eggs, and dairy products. The production of all of these foods is woman-dominated. This is an indication that the goods produced by increased female agricultural labor would probably be the products that Yemen needs most. Now I want to move on and look at another sector, but let me summarize what we've seen here first. First, food imports can be a limit to investment in products that are necessary for development and the expansion of Yemen's modern economy. They are likely to be even more limiting in the future. Second, the 2 keys to increasing domestic food production lie in 1, making available increased female labor time for agricultural activities through technological improvements such as village water supply and commercial fuels, and 2, increasing the productivity of that labor time through education and extension. Let me repeat that. Technology and education combined can increase female labor time and productivity. Let's see if these 2 keys apply in other areas. We've seen that food imports represent a major foreign exchange drain, but they are not the only one. Here we see the graph of money from Yemeni workers in other countries. But now, on the same graph, we can see the flow of money back out of Yemen from foreign workers in this country. Around 20% of the money from workers in other countries, in effect, turns right around and goes back out. But that's not all. This display does not include the fact that the education system is largely financed by other countries and staffed by foreign workers, primarily Egyptians. At present levels, around 600 million rials goes straight from other countries to Egypt rather than into Yemen. How significant is the number of foreign workers in Yemen? Well, we don't have data for many areas, but we do have data for workers in the Ministry of Health and for teachers. In 1983, the most recent year for which we have data, 41% of Ministry of Health workers and 87% of all teachers were from other countries. In addition, it must be pointed out that in the Ministry of Health, foreign workers are heavily weighted toward the highest skill positions. Over 50% of doctors and nearly 2/3 of nurses were from other countries. Let's look out to the year 2000 again, this time within the education system. Assuming a constant increase of 1 percentage point per year in all male enrollment rates, the number of teachers required in Yemen will rise from 9,000 in 1975 to over 40,000 in 2000. Assuming that 90% of these positions continue to be filled by non-Yemenis, there will be 36,000 foreign teachers in Yemen in the year 2000, shown here in the blue shaded area. The estimated cost of the teachers, which either represents money that could come to Yemen but continues to pass through, or money that Yemen will have to pay if the other countries reduce education funding, will rise from 400 million rials in 1975 to 1.7 billion in the year 2000. That's equivalent to the entire 1979 food import bill. How can the resources of Yemeni women be used to ease this problem? Well, some initial investment is required, but the payoff is very short and very good. In this display, it has been assumed that all female enrollment rates increase at the same 1 percentage point per year that had been projected earlier for males. The impact, not surprisingly, is an increase in the teacher requirement from 40,000 in the year 2000 under our previous assumption to nearly 60,000. Since more teachers just cost more money, that really hasn't helped solve our problem. However, let's look at the number of these teachers that would still be from other countries if we could get just 10% of the secondary school graduating girls to become primary school teachers. As you can see here, even though the first increased class of graduates doesn't become available until 1990, the impact is dramatic and very quick. In fact, all primary school teacher positions could be filled very quickly under this program, and efforts could be shifted to preparatory and secondary school teachers, which have a similar but slightly longer term payoff. The number of foreign teachers required in 2000 would be down from 36,000 to only 24,000. Let's look at what the monetary impact of this program would be. Here you can see the payments required for non-Yemeni teachers under the previous assumption. With increased female enrollments, it is not surprising that the cost for teachers is initially higher, but they become balanced between 1990 and 1995. After that, the money flowing away from Yemen is reduced significantly. The savings, shaded in green, represent nearly 2 billion rials. The annual payment in the year 2000 would be down to 1.2 billion rials, a reduction of 500 million rials per year. In past presentations, people have frequently pointed out that using these women as teachers removes them from the agricultural labor force and is therefore in disagreement with the previous agriculture sector discussion. Let me point out that this entire new group of teachers amounts to only around 12,000 women. Even if this entire force were taken from rural areas, this represents only 0.5% of the female agricultural workforce. The impact of this very small reduction in labor force is more than made up for by the increased productivity of the better educated workforce. Again, let me summarize before proceeding to the next section. As in the agriculture section, technologies that allow time to take advantage of education and the increased productivity resulting from that education were the keys to reducing foreign exchange outflows by increasing the potential of a resource already available here in Yemen. In the health sector, the situation is very similar to that of education. A significant percentage of the workers, particularly the highly skilled ones, are from other countries. In addition, it is generally felt that the healthcare sector is badly understaffed. Because of this, Yemen's development goals include objectives relating to the vast expansion of healthcare services. In 1980, it was estimated that healthcare was available to only around 12% of Yemen's people. The stated goal of the government is healthcare for everyone, but there's a lot of work to do before this can become a reality. To be a little more cautious, I've done this projection on the assumption that healthcare can be provided to 50% of the people by the year 2000. Under that assumption,